Game started.
UI pawn. Okay. E4. How about a Sicilian? Haven't played one of those in a while. Okay, plays that funny bishop c4 line. That has a name, but I can't think of it right now. So blunting the bishop with this move seems reasonable. And you can go for a quick d5 to gain a tempo on the bishop. See where it wants to go. And so developing this bishop to block the e-file here and defend the pawn. I'm undecided about knight to f6 at this point. He can pin. So the question is, do I really want to waste the time and play h6 before playing knight f6? But the pin is kind of annoying. And I've gained a lot by getting these two pawns in the center already, so maybe I shouldn't try for too much. So let's spend a move on h6 just so I can get knight f6 solidly in place, and then should be able to castle and get a reasonable position. So this bishop, does it want to go to d6 or e7? Probably d6 is the better square. But he does have the knight to b5. And then I would have to move it anyway. But then he would have to move his knight. So bishop d6, knight b5, bishop e7, and it's his move. Or I could just play bishop e7 and it's his move, but his knight will still be here instead of being on b5. Hard to say. Just go to e7 and castle. And then after I've castled, maybe play some move like a6 to keep the knight from coming into b5, and then the bishop there. Of course, now the bishop could go here with a tempo on the knight, but he would probably just play, and he's probably going to play f4 anyway to defend that knight. So let's just castle. It's not making any immediate threats. And then I'm going to challenge that knight first with knight to start with knight to c6. That's how I'm going to challenge that knight. And he defends with the bishop in advance. Reasonable thing to do. So here's a thought. If I go here, he could exchange first and then play knight. No, I can't. If he exchanges first, I control the b5 square with the pawn. So I can go here. I was worried there was some way he could clear this diagonal with tempo and the knight to b5 would be an annoying threat. But the pawn on c3 covers b5, so this seems like a fine way to play. Now he's attacking c6. Pawn on c6. I think I said c3 there, but I meant the pawn on c6. So I should defend it. This guy is loose. So I could, when he takes here, he hits the rook. So we will start by defending that pawn. And then come back to this question of the loose bishop on f4. Is there a good way to take advantage of that? Knight h5 is covered by the queen. Knight to e or d5 is not happening. I mean, pawn here, then knight d5. But he gets, after pawn here, well, maybe that's an idea. Let's think about this. Pawn to d5. His knight can't come to these squares, but it could go to e4. Then I take, and then he takes with the pawn. That gives me this advanced pawn on d4, which is kind of interesting. Maybe it has ideas of pushing on to Maybe it would come with ideas of pushing on to d3. So let's go for that. I'm not entirely sure about this, but it looks interesting. Let's see. After things have traded off, I could consider going after the b pawn. Rook to b8. Let him take this c pawn, and then I take on b2. That might be. So my idea here was just to take that knight and bring the pawn here and create this different pawn structure. Yeah, I have this clump of pawns that could push forward. So I think that's interesting. And of course he has a majority on the king side now. So can I push immediately? No. Can I do something interesting with my bishops? Okay, well, let's think about this idea. Oh, okay, I don't have rook b8 because of his bishop. Let's try bishop f6. The idea is to push this pawn forward and take on b2. He can push his pawn to all the way to e5, supported by the bishop. But, okay, so he just defended b2. Reasonable way to play. Yeah, I was going to say, if he pushes it forward, it gives up the d5 square for this light squared bishop, which might be interesting. Okay, so what now? Do I want to just run this h-pawn forward? I can take it. The queen is still covering the h5 square. Okay, I can play bishop c4 with a tempo and then drop the bishop back to bishop c4 to b5. Maybe cause some trouble for this guy, and it's a tempo move because it hits the rook. If he pushes his pawn forward, I'm just going to drop back. There is the idea of going to g5 or h4 too, I guess. I will think about that. So I was going to drop back to b5 here, harass his bishop. Get rid of that annoying pressure on the c-pawn. He sort of has to take or defend. Maybe he could just defend it. If he drops back, I can hit it with the pawn. And that should be good for me. Should be trapping the bishop. He has intermediate moves. He has moves like b or e5. Yeah, I was just wondering about that. But I take his bishop. He takes my bishop. I take the pawn. I come out a pawn ahead. And I'll have a light squared bishop. He'll have a dark squared bishop. So it'll be opposite colored bishops. My bishop will be out here looking at his pawn, and my queen will be out here. This c-pawn maybe will be loose. Yeah, well, my queen is guarding that square. Let's go for it. Let's grab that pawn and follow through the consequences here. So it's a trade. And he kicks this guy back. He could follow up with a4, keep kicking my bishop back, but I think I'm going to get in c4 and e3, supported by this bishop. And he wants to go to an endgame. let's put the queen on a light square. Take a look at his b pawn there. I mean, the endgame isn't necessarily bad for me, but it's not necessarily great either. This pawn is defended by the rook, the queen, and the bishop, so even if he kicks the bishop back, I've still got ideas to move those pawns forward. And to keep the c pawn defended. Let's see, I guess taking on c2 is not really a threat because queen takes c2, rook c1, and he's going to grab the pawn on c5. But he defended anyway. So I want to play c4 here followed by d3. c4, he takes, I take. That's still defended. c4, he pushes forward, then I push on with d3. And now d3 comes with the threat of d2 forking the two rooks. So I'm sort of expecting him to take. Offers the queen trade again. Let's think about this. I may have trouble avoiding it now. So I take the queen. I don't want him to take the queen and pull this f-pawn back to the g-file, although it does open up this f-file for my rook. But anyway, I take, he takes. He's hitting this pawn. I go forward. I can take here. That's not so great. So I take, he takes. I guess I have to defend that pawn, and then he can yeah, he can bring his bishop into e5 there, hitting the pawn also. Not so great. So, well, how about if I take a pawn here? Let him take my queen. Or if he takes the pawn, then I will take another pawn. So he took back. He didn't take the queen, he took the pawn. Now, if I trade queens, he takes, I can push on with e4 immediately. Now, let's bring the rook here. Let's get the rook behind the d-pawn. I'm just a little worried about if I push this pawn forward, he can push his pawn forward. But then I can fork the two rooks. So I guess he has to take. Now, take with the rook, I guess. So yeah, he gets an endgame. I have an extra pawn, and he has, and we have opposite-colored bishops, but there's still rooks on. So just need to work out the right way to coordinate my rook and bishop, and my bishop is nicely anchored here. That's one good point in my position here. So should I start pressuring his bishop immediately? Oh, he left his pawn undefended here. I should grab that pawn is what I should do. And he can't immediately get a rook to the second rank. Interestingly, but he could threaten to put a rook to the second rank. And I can't put a rook to the second rank right now. I can't play rook c7 because the bishop is guarding that square. But if he brings his rook to the e file, I can block with my rook. Or if he goes there, just hold on to that pawn for the moment. And just start pushing the c-pawn. So if he drops the bishop back along this diagonal, then I can play rook to c7, defending this pawn. The one thing he has going for him is with his dark squared bishop, he can coordinate against my pawns that are on dark squares. So I have to be careful about rook and bishop combining against g7 there. Okay, I'm down to a minute. I should pay attention to that too. Yeah, so we went there with the rook first. Not a bad idea, but I can push this pawn with the dual purpose of defending his rook invasion. Could also have defended with the rook. And just a good idea to get that pawn going forward. That's going to be the decider. This bishop is nicely anchored, and I have a free pawn to push that he'll have to, I think, sacrifice that bishop to stop. Yeah, so he goes forward. Let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and push that one step forward. Step by step. His king can always escape to h2 now. He's got his bishop on that diagonal, and I don't have a bishop for the dark squared diagonal, so that's one thing he has going for him. So if he plants the bishop here, it takes me two moves, rook here to get my pieces lined up against it. And he has two moves to bring his rook over to line up to defend the bishop. And then I guess I bring my king into the game. Okay, white is looking for a plan here. Thing is, with all his pieces tied up, there he goes. If all his pieces are tied up defending that bishop, then bringing my king in should be pretty straightforward. I guess I first have to put these pawns onto light squares. Ah, so that's his idea. Okay. There, that will keep control of the c3 square. Although after I play pawn to c3, what next? How do I ever move it forward? I think I need to bring the king in. So probably I should move these pawns onto light squares first, to the extent possible. Well, looks like he's going to run out of time here. Yep, there he goes.
White forfeits on time.
Okay, well, anyway, I will upload this and do a postmortem. Maybe I can figure out how I should continue from here, and if it actually is a win. I guess there's another threat of just rook to a3. Yeah, but the rook is defended. Okay, anyway, I will check that out in the postmortem. See you guys later. Bye.